All right, guys, I'm going to try to get through this fairly quickly. Let's hope we can get through most of this in maybe 30 minutes. A lot of this is going to be pictures and things, and I'll tell you what you need to know for your test and give you some tips on how to remember some of these things. But joints are what we're looking at where bones come together, and we call those articulations. And so anywhere two bones meet, that's going to be articulation. Typically, you have ligaments there. You may have some tendons that connect muscle to bone near the joint. And the function of joints is to basically give the skeleton mobility, right, and hold the skeleton together. There's several classifications that we need to look at, and it's kind of complicated to figure out which one's which. But I'll try to take you through this and kind of clear that up. But the structural classification, what is the joint made of? Right? What is binding the joint together? Is it fibrous tissue, cartilaginous tissue, or is it a synovial joint that has fluids and things associated with it? We need to look at this and kind of determine what type of joint we have based on what kind of tissue is there. The other is the functional classification. And is it immovable? Is it slightly movable, or is it freely movable? So synarthrosis, anytime you hear syn, S-Y-N, that means it's immovable. Amphi means slightly movable, and that's kind of, amphi means kind of in between. You know, we call it amphibian, like a newt or a salamander or a frog, in between an aquatic species like a fish and a land-based fish, a land-based organism like maybe a reptile or something. So that's what we mean by amphi. It's in between, and then diarthrosis are freely movable. So dia means to be free. There's actually, I think, a Greek god named Dia that means freedom. So I think that's where that might come from. Most of this is Latin, but I think some of that's from Greek. But anyway, these are basically more clear cut, so that's what we'll use. Sorry, my dog quit. They're scratching. Sorry, guys. All right, so fibrous joints are joints that are bound by dense fibrous connective tissue. There's no joint cavity, and we'll see a joint cavity later on the synovial joints. And most of these are immovable. And if you remember what immovable is, if we go back, anytime you hear syn, that's going to be an immovable joint, S-Y-N, okay? And there's three types of fibrous joints. Sutures, mainly found in the skull. Syndesmosis, we find these between certain bones in the arms and legs, and then gomphosis is where we find the peg and socket joint of the tooth into the mandible and into the maxilla of the skull. Now, sutures are rigid interlocking joints of the skull. When we're born, these are not fused, and they are going to be open, and we even have the fontanols that you've looked at in lab to where the bones haven't completely come together yet and form these sutures. In middle age, the sutures ossify and fuse, and we can actually look at a skull and tell how old a person is based on the formation of that. Now, once you reach middle age, around 35, 40 years old, any skull past that's going to pretty much look the same, but we can tell if you're in your 20s, 30s, or younger by looking at the suture of the skull. And between that and other things on the skeleton, they can identify you. And when I say we, I mean forensic scientists and people that look at these type things. But closed immovable sutures, we call these syn, again, immovable. Ostosis, and that's going to be a joint that doesn't move at all. So when we say immovable, these are completely immovable. They're basically fused together like they're welded. Once, again, adolescence occurs and you get into adulthood and the middle age. So we can see those here. You're going to learn these in lab. You're going to learn all about the sutures that are on the skull. Hopefully If you're in my class, you learned that today in lab. So hopefully you were able to see some of those: the coronal suture, sagittal suture, rhomboid suture, some of the different ones on the skull. Syndesmosis, these are bones connected by ligaments or bands of fibrous tissue, and these vary in movement. Some can move a little bit and some don't really move at all. So we can kind of look at this with the radius and the ulna, or we can look at this with the tib-fib joint. You can see the ligament here. We can twist our foot around just slightly, but these bones do not move away from each other. It's not like a joint like you would look at in the elbow or the knee or something like that, where you can have a freely movable joint. So these are slightly movable, even though there's syndesmosis that says they're completely immovable. What that means is the bones do not come apart from each other. They don't move. All you can do is rotate here. Right? Gomphosis, peg and socket. Again, this is a tooth. This is a good example. The periodontal ligament holds a tooth in its socket. Let's just move over to it and we can look at it. So you can see here that this tooth is held in by this periodontal ligament that comes down through here. Now, if I knock a tooth out, if I preserve that tooth in a cool environment, a good dentist can put that back in and actually restore that tooth to this socket, and we can actually get it to adhere back in here. Now, the problem with that, if you ever knock it out, these nerves are severed, and a lot of times you won't have a lot of feeling around that tooth. You won't be able to have a lot of sensation with it. But at least the tooth goes back in and is actually replaced without having to put a false tooth or do a root canal and that kind of thing to repair that injury. Cartilaginous joints, these are unified by cartilage, and these are going to have no joint cavity, similar to the ones we're going to look at in a few minutes with the synovial joint. Synchondrosis and symphysis, again, we have the syn, that means no movement. Syn means slight movement. And I'll get to what that means here in a second. So synchondrosis is a bar or plate of hyaline cartilage that unites the bones. Most are immovable. So temporary epiphyseal plate joints, if you remember from the last chapter when I was talking about the growth plate in a bone, let's say the femur, you have that epiphyseal line, and while you're developing, that's cartilage, and it eventually ossifies when growth hormone levels fall, and then you start to fuse that together. So they become synostosis after plate closure, but before that, they are slightly movable. And what I mean by that is that it can shift around a little bit and help with some stability. Now, we see sports injuries a lot with those because people are moving around and there's only cartilage in between the two bones, and it's kind of weak, or a lot weaker than an ossified bone, and it'll tend to slip a little bit. The cartilage, the first rib with the manubrium of the sternum, which is the upper part of the sternum, that little top part that you'll learn in lab. That is also a synchondrosis. Anytime you hear chondro, that means cartilage. Syn means immovable, so this is an immovable cartilage joint. But the inherent nature of cartilage is it's flexible. And even though it doesn't move, it flexes. And it allows some movement, not much, even though we call it immovable, it does a lot more than where we get some of the other tighter joints that we're going to talk about later. Right, so here you can see the epiphyseal plate, and that's a temporary hyaline cartilage joint. And then you can see also here the manubrium and the joint between the first rib and the sternum. Again, that's immovable, but it's flexible. Right? So don't get those two terms interchanged. Just because it's immovable doesn't mean it's not flexible. And flexible just means it can be in shape as it needs to. So if you're twisting and moving around, sometimes those will move slightly, but they're still considered immovable because they don't move against each other. Symphyses, these are going to be cartilage joints that are mainly fibrocartilage, and these are going to be in areas where we need movement at specialized times in life. Let's look at the pubic symphysis as a great example. And I think we have a picture over here on this one. The pubic symphysis, let's say this is, which is a female. Notice this is greater than 90 degrees right here, so that is a female. During childbirth, this is able to flex just a little bit to allow the baby to move through the birth canal. And that's a good thing because, if you have a really large baby, it's hard for that baby's head to move through. Once the head moves through, the rest of it's pretty easy, but it's getting that head out, the crowning part, that's the most difficult. So again, these cartilaginous joints are pretty immovable, but they will stretch and flex a little bit. Again, anytime you have cartilage, doesn't matter what the classification of the joint is, it's going to move a little. But we classify it on the amount of movement. And basically, we can say here that these are immovable because there's just not much movement going on unless childbirth or something like that's occurring. Now, synovial joints, these are the most complicated joints in the body, and they are the most prevalent joints in the body. So almost all of our limb joints, they usually have a couple of characteristics in common. They have bursa, they have tendencies, they have stability, and they allow several types of movement, and we classify these into 6 different types. I recommend when you're studying this chapter to make a chart and try to break down all the different joints where they fit in and kind of organize them together. Because it gets a little complicated trying to just strictly remember these and memorize them. So when we're looking at the different types of joints, again, just kind of make a chart and pick out the ones that fit into this category, this category, this category, and then break them down further from there. And I think that'll help you study. If I think about it, I think I want to work. I'm not going to work tomorrow because we have in-service and we're doing it all online this time. But when I go in on Thursday, I will try to find that and post it for you. I have a document I made one time that has kind of an outline of a chart to get you started, and then you fill the rest up in. So I'll try to remember to do that. If I don't, somebody message me and let me know, and I'll put that in for you. All right, so let's go into the different types of joints. So synovial joints have 6 general features. Articular cartilage. This is hyaline cartilage that covers the ends of the bone. And we talked about this in the last chapter where bones come together, they rub together. They're going to have that cartilage there to prevent bone from rubbing into bone. And then we have a joint cavity, or the synovial cavity, that's fluid filled. And this is to provide lubrication and also help the joint move very easily and clearly. So let's think of our knee and our elbow. Those are classic examples of synovial joints. And then we have that articular capsule, which is 2 layers thick. We have a fibrous layer of dense irregular connective tissue, which you should be familiar with. And then we have the inner synovial membrane, which is loose connective tissue. And in between that, we're going to have synovial fluid. And this is mainly made of hyaluronic acid. And that's going to be something that we'll talk about more in the future with some of the other things that contain fluids in the joints and the bones. Okay, so that synovial fluid, again, is viscous, slippery. It's a filtrated plasma, and again, it's hyaluronic acid. But again, it acts as a lubricant and nourishes the articular cartilage. And it also contains immune cells called phagocytic cells, which remove microbes and debris. So if something gets into the joint, they will take care of that and make sure that it doesn't become infected. They don't use that synovial fluid and the proteins in their food and energy, and that they are able to eliminate those in time for you to not set up an infection. The other reinforcing ligaments, we have capsular, extracapsular, intercapsular. I'll show you these on a diagram here in a couple of minutes, and you'll see where those are located. Nerves and blood vessels, we have those in the joints. Number one, to detect pain in case something's going on with the joint. It also monitors the position of the joint, the stretch of the joint. Capillary beds supply the filtrate for the synovial fluid and the hyaluronic acid predominantly. But when you move a joint, your brain is getting a signal from it, telling that joint where it's at in space, so that it knows where to grab something. And your brain is you're telling, excuse me, your muscle, and it's telling that muscle how much force to generate, what muscles um, to grasp with. Let's say picking up a glass of water, for instance, it's going to tell your muscles how to gently grab the glass, and how to put it towards your lips and that kind of thing. And that's a learned behavior. But once you learn that, those nerves are going to get those impulses from the brain and tell it what to do, when to do it. When you're a kid, you have no control over anything. You try to walk and you fall down. You try to drink something and you spill it all over. You try to eat food, it's all over your shirt. But as you learn and your brain gets that memory in there, then it's easier for you to do those tasks. And it's those nerves or the joints that allow you to do that. All right, so the general structure of a synovial joint, you basically have, again, your articular cartilage in blue that you see on both sides of the bone. And then in between, you have the synovial fluid, right? And then usually you have ligaments that hold these bones together. And then you have a synovial membrane that holds that fluid inside. So again, as these two bones rotate around one another, they move around one another, they're not touching. They have that slippery fluid, almost like acts like motor oil in a car in your piston. Even though the piston is 1/1000th of an inch from the cylinder wall, it never touches it because that oil is in between. And that's what you want. And the same thing happens with your joints. Now, again, as you get older, that fluid and that space tends to break down, and now your bones start rubbing against one another. And what do we call it when you inflame a joint? Arthritis. Right? Anytime you hear arthro, that means joint. Itis meaning inflammation. So arthritis is going to result when this fluid breaks down and this articular cartilage breaks down, just from wear and tear as you get older. Now, other features of some synovial joints, we have fatty pads. This is a cushion between the fibrous layer of the capsule and the synovial membrane. These are the areas that you're going to encounter, bumps and things like that. So your knee would be a good example. Where you have these little fatty pads that kind of cushion the blow. So if you fall on your knee, let's say you're playing football and you get tackled and you fall on your knee, that's part of the protective layer that you have. The articular disc or menisci, and I'm going to put some videos up later showing them working on a meniscus repair, and you'll be able to see what that is exactly. It's fibrocartilage that separates the outer surfaces to kind of improve the fit or make the bones fit together better. And it also stabilizes the joint. The main one we worry about is the knee. The knee holds up a lot of weight, and there's a lot of damage to that meniscus if you play sports and you're kind of in the wear and tear runners, big with runners. You get these meniscus tears and things that you have to go in surgical repair. Now, remember, anytime you deal with connective tissue, most connective tissue and muscle, for that instance, do not regenerate. So if you lose this, you wear it out, it's gone, and it's not going to come back. So you have to kind of keep that in mind as you get older. You might want to continue to exercise, but not as vigorously as far as jogging and things like that. Maybe you want to revert back to walking or something that's a little less strenuous on the body. Now, bursa and tendon sheaths. Bursa basically are ball bearings. They just prevent the bones from rubbing together. They kind of move back and forth. If you ever had one of those little snakes that you want at the fair, not like a rubber snake, but they were a little fluid filled, almost like a balloon, but it was hollow through the middle. And when you played with it, all you had to do is touch it and it would move and it would kind of roll over on itself. That's what a bursa is like. Tendon sheaths are similar, except they are wrapped around a tendon and kind of act like a cable on a bicycle or a motorcycle when you pull the brake. There's a tendon going through the middle of it, and it's a sheath around the outside. It's that plastic outside that you don't see moving when you pull the brake. It's the inside part that's actually moving. So, very similar to that. So let me pull a picture up for you and kind of show you what this looks like. So here we have a bursa. So as this humerus rotates around and around, this will just roll back and forth like a set of ball bearings. And then the tendon sheath is going to surround the tendon from the muscle. And as that muscle contracts, it's going to move back and forth, again, similar to what we see with the bicycle brake or a motorcycle brake, or a clutch or whatever on a two-wheeled vehicle. Even the clutch in your car sometimes works this way if it's old enough. If you work on cars, you may realize that. But again, notice the complexity of this joint compared to some of the others we've already looked at. A lot of things going on. We have tendon, ligaments, we have bursa, we have tendon sheaths. We have a lot of different, anatomical parts listed on here that you need to look at. So again, this is a bursa, and again, as it moves this way, the bursa is going to roll in the opposite direction. So it acts like that snake that you used to get at Six Flags when you were a kid, or at the county fair or a carnival. But it simply allows the rolling motion to occur so that you don't wear it out. If you've ever heard of rotator cuff surgery, that's involving this area. I think Tommy John surgery is involved in this area, if I remember correctly. But it's dealing with the overuse of the arm by pitching baseballs, and then sometimes these tendons and bursa and things get inflamed, and that can become chronic, and that's when you need to have surgery done. Right. So what affects the stability of the synovial joint? What is the articular surface like? Is it a really deep ball and socket like we see with the hip and the acetabellum of the pelvis? How many ligaments do we have? Do we have muscle tone? I know in A&P1 we used to talk about muscle tone. I don't know, since you guys were online last semester, if y'all went over that, but muscle tone is a partial state of contraction of the muscle, and it stays that way until basically your brain tells it not to. And if you're in good shape, that muscle tone will help hold those joints tight to one another so they don't break apart. I just realized this is A&P1, and I made a statement about A&P2. We talk about this again, but muscle tone is very important in keeping those joints together and keeping them from tearing apart during traumatic events or trauma or whatever. So again, they reinforce a lot of the joints of the body. The shoulder, the knee, and the arches of the foot are most important as far as keeping muscle tone. So it's good to work out your legs more than your arms. And if you do work out, running, whatever you want to do, just try to keep the legs in shape, because that's going to be very important in the way that you can move around and get around, especially as you get older. If you are sedentary, for the last half of your life, you're not going to live as long as someone that gets out and moves, gets their heart rate up a little bit, and maybe just take a walk by the duck pond or go out and watch birds if you're, up in the age. My mom does that every day. She's the most peaceful person I've ever met. I couldn't do it. She'll sit out in her yard every day and just watch the birds and be as happy as she can be. But that's part of it. I mean, it's trying to keep the body, in movement, keep motion, and keep things going. That's what I always tell her. I was like, always get outside, always move around, get a little exercise, keep those muscles working, keep those bones working, so that you don't have any atrophy. And that's what you worry about with muscle tone, is atrophy. If you lay in the bed for a long time, or you're in the hospital for an extended stay, sometimes that'll happen. That muscle tone will go away, and then the muscle will atrophy, and it takes you a long time to build those back up, especially when you get older. All right. These are self-explanatory. I'm not going to go over these with you. You just need to memorize these. And what I mean by that, and I don't know how well you can see this, but the slideshow is on Blackboard and you can read it. But the joint is always named after the two bones that are coming together. So you can kind of look down through some of these names and see exactly, where this joint occurs and what two bones is going to occur between. And there's several different diagrams of this. Let me find a good example of one. Yeah, here, the glenohumeral joint. I mean, that's the glenoid cavity here of the scapula, and then we have the head of the humerus that fits in here. So it's basically named after the two parts that come together. We can look at the same thing down here with the elbow. We can look at it. Let me see a better one. You can see easier. Coxel doesn't work, but it's got a specialized name. That's an old naming system. But anyway, just make sure you look over this chart and learn how to name these. A lot of these are named after the two bones that come together. So if I have a femur and the tibia come together, it's going to basically be named that way. Right? It's going to be named after the two bones that interact with each other. Right. Now, when we look at muscles and joints, and we'll visit this again when we get to the muscles chapter, but the origin of a muscle is the attachment to the immovable bone, and the insertion is the attachment to the movable bone. And usually, not always, but 99% of the time, muscle contraction causes the insertion to move towards the origin. And they can move in a transverse way, a frontal way, or a sagittal way. And we just need to look into how these joints are named in order to figure out, kind of what we're looking at. So the range of motion allowed by synovial joints, we have non-axial, which means slipping move only, uniaxial, movement in one plane, biaxial, movement in two planes, and then multi-axial, which is where we have movement in and around all three planes. And then there's three general types of movement. We have gliding, which is like the prom girl waving as the homecoming queen, which she's going by, waving her hand back and forth. Those wrist bones are gliding past one another. Angular movements, think of your elbow, we can have 90 degree or 45 degree or 180 degree movement with it. Rotation, just think about your arm and rotating your arm back and forth, making a cone with your hand. All right, so that's a good way to look at it. I'm going to show you some pictures here in a minute of all these movements. So if you don't understand what one is now, maybe the picture will help you out. So gliding movement is where one flat bone surface glides or slips over another. So the intercarpal, intertarsal, between the vertebrae, those are all going to be areas where you have these gliding movements occurring. Again, this is the prom queen waving to the crowd and kind of moving her hand back and forth with that little, kind of prom queen look that you see here. Now, on your test, I'm going to have pictures like this. May not be the exact same ones, but I'm going to ask you what movement they are making. And I'll go through each one with you here in a second. But this is the gliding movement. Again, if you see the hand going back and forth, you know that those bones are gliding past one another. And if you're in lab today, this is what I was talking about, saying Sally left the party to take Kathy home. That's the way to remember all these little wrist bones that are in here. Now, angular movements, we have flexion, and we have, again, it's easier to show you a picture than all the words, but extension is where you move away from the midline. Flexion is where you move towards the midline. Think of your bicep. If you flex your bicep, you bring your hands towards the midline. So that's flexion. When you do an extension on the weight bench, you are extending the arms out, and that's called an extension. Hyperextension is kind of rare in the body. We don't want to see that most of the time because that's usually not a good thing. It's usually an injury. Sorry. But hyper means over extension. So if you go past the normal movement of the head or the arm or the elbow, the knee, that can be catastrophic, especially the knee and the elbow. Most sports injuries occur in the knee and the elbow. That's the majority of them, other than a hamstring pull, which is um, in the back of the leg. So again, just make sure you know these movements. And if I show you something similar to this, you should be able to pick it out which movement it is. Again, you can do this with your back. You can flex. You can extend, hyperextend. Again, another good example. Oops, get back. So flexion is, again, bringing towards the midline. And then if you extend, it's going away from the line. Right? Hyperextension will be going past that. So if you get arrested by a cop, they're going to pull your hands behind your back and lift up on them. Well, that's going to hyperextend just a little bit and make the guy uncomfortable so he complies to get the car, whatever they want to do. So again, this is simply, in a lot of martial arts take advantage of a lot of these movements, because if it take you out of your normal movement and it causes pain, you don't know what to do, and you're not going to be much of a fighter anymore. And that's why martial arts kind of trains those type of moves. All right, angular movement. Again, let's just go to the pictures. Abduction is where you move up from the midline. Adduction moves towards the midline. And the way I remember this, there's a muscle in an oyster called the adductor muscle. You have to shuck. When you're shucking an oyster, that's what you're cutting into. That's the muscle that closes the shell. So if you remember adduction, it closes the arm down to the body. Abduction is the opposite. It goes away from the body. And then we have circumduction, is where you kind of spiral your arm in a cone-like fashion. Right, rotation. Basically, rotation is just spinning around on a axle. And we can do that with a neck. We can do a little bit of lateral rotation, and we can even do a little medial rotation with our knee. Our knee is a pretty complicated joint, and it allows us to do a lot of movements you wouldn't think it would. Right, special movements, supination, pronation. I'll give you an easy way to remember this, but all this is flipping of the hand. So if I take my hand with my palm down and I open it up, that's supination. If I take an open palm and close it down, that's pronation. And the easiest way to remember this is supination. It's like you're bringing supper to the table. You're holding your hand up with your palm up with a plate on it. That's the way I remember it. If that works for you, use it. If not, then find another way to remember it. But to me, that was an easy way to deal with that. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Always remember plantar means the bottom of the foot. So if we're doing plantar flexion, we're moving down. If we're doing dorsiflexion, we're moving back up. Right? So down and up with those movements. Right? Inversion and eversion. Inversion, you're moving inward towards the body plane. In eversion, you're moving out away from the body plane. So these should be pretty easy to remember. In and ev. Ev meaning out. So inversion, you're coming in with the foot. Eversion, you're going out with the foot. Now, I can't do this because my jaw pops. I have TMJ, and every time I try to present this in front of a live class, it always pops on me. It gives me pain. But protraction of the mandible is sticking the mandible out front of the upper maxilla teeth, right? Retraction is where you pull it back behind. Some people are born with a natural protraction. Some people are born with a natural retraction. And most people are born kind of in the middle, where you have a little bit of both. And that's what we consider normal facial feature. But you see someone that has a strong underbite like this, their jaw is protracting too much. And if you see someone with an overbite like this, the retraction is occurring too much. Again, today that's pretty easily treated. If you find it early enough as a kid, they can use braces and things to to help out with that. Now, elevation and depression. Elevation is bringing up, just like an elevator goes up. Depression is bringing down. So that's a pretty easy one to remember too. So up with the jaw, elevation, down with the jaw, depression. Now, opposition is something special to us primates and a few other animals, not many, but we have what's called an opposable thumb. Doesn't seem very important to you. I promise you, in the evolutionary history of primates and humans, it's extremely important. So what do I mean by that? This gives us the ability to grasp and hold things. I would probably go to jail today if I did this again. But the first year I taught, back in 99, I took my students and I duct taped their thumb to their hand. And I made them go around school all day without a thumb. I know it sounds crazy nowadays in 2020, but back then you could get away with this kind of stuff. And it wasn't anything harmful anyway. It should still be allowed to go a little bit. But I take their thumb and I'm like, I want you to go around and understand what it's like not having an opposable thumb. And it was a evolutionary biology class I was teaching. And they went around and all day long they had to use their four fingers to try to pick up the nut. I mean, try it yourself. Just tuck your thumb under and try using it to do your everyday thing. Try using your phone without your thumb. It's not easy. That is a advantage that primates have over other species of mammals, and that allows us to build and use tools. And believe it or not, even other primates like chimpanzees and things use tools, not like we do. You know, they don't fathom a hammer and go out there, but they'll take a stick and poke it into a hole trying to get some food out. They will do things that most other animals can't do because they don't have the ability to do it. The only other one that I can think of with a true opposable thumb is an opossum, the American opossum, or Virginia opossum, that lives here in America. Is the only marsupial, and they can grab anything. The other one is not a true opposable thumb, but a raccoon is also able to get into anything. The reason being, they have that extra digit out there to help them out. It's not a true opposable thumb for a raccoon, but it might as well be. They can get into anything and do anything. So, the reason that was developed was for tree climbing, and our ancestors, whatever they were probably tree climbing organisms, and then we developed the opposable thumb from that, and our brain enlarged, and we were able to use it to make tools and then construct things, and basically we wouldn't be civilized without it. So it's a really important feature that we have. All right, types of synovial joints. I am going to kind of leave this up to you to memorize. I can't teach this stuff because there's no real way to teach it. I can show it to you, and I'll run through them really quickly. But basically, you just need to memorize what these joints are. You will need to know these for your test. So let's go through each one. So a hinge joint is like a hinge on your door. It basically pivots back and forth, and we have this axis like in your elbow. You can see the radius, the ulna and the humerus coming together, and you have this exact fit like a hinge where it moves back and forth, and it only moves in one direction. It moves up and down, up and down. Here we have a atlantoaxial joint, and you can see the uniaxial movement where we can kind of twist. And basically, this gives us the ability to twist our arm back and forth, kind of in a rotating fashion, to allow that to rotate through this little sheath that we see on here, and that allows us to move our arm not just forward and back, not just left and right, but we can actually twist and turn. So think about twisting a screw into a bolt. You're using this joint. Right? So here we have a condylar joint, and we can see we have biaxial movement, which means we can move in two directions. So this is going to be at the end of your finger. All right. Don't get confused because your hand comes all the way out to here. At least the skin of your hand does. This is back in your wrist. So even though you're looking at the skeletal model here, just remember those metacarpals are the long bones that go up to the fingers, which are called the phalanges. This is the joint in between them. So it's kind of a circular surface. So if I take my big finger, my pointer finger, I can kind of rotate it around and move and say, no, no, no to that. So that's a good example of that. And then we have what's called a saddle joint that occurs with our thumb. If you'll take your thumb, you can't move it nearly as well as you can one of your fingers. It's more of a biaxial movement, but it still has some movement left and right as well. Right, ball and socket, this is multi-axial. We sacrifice stability here with the glenohumeral joint because we don't have a lot of ligaments here. And it gives us a lot of movement, but it's easy for this to dislocate. It's easy for this to come out of socket. So you can kind of see how shallow that socket is and how easy that would be to kind of pull away. So we see that with that joint. And then I'm going to stop here and I will make a new one later on tonight or tomorrow. I've got in-service tomorrow, so it'll probably be tomorrow afternoon before I get back on this. I need to get into bed. It's getting a little late, 11:30. But anyway, we'll pick back up here, and I should be able to finish this up pretty quickly tomorrow. I don't think we have, but just a few more slides left. We're about halfway through, so that should be about right. And a lot of them, again, are pictures, so it shouldn't take long to go through all of those. So anyway, I'll post this one, and then I'll post the next one tomorrow, and that'll get us done. Don't forget your test is next weekend, due on Sunday night, and I'll see you next time I make a video.